Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library Podcast, a window into the soul of the North Fork of Long Island. We'll delve into the pulse of our community, its pressing issues, promising opportunities, and the rich stories that weave our shared history. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 88, we sit down with Ron Rothman, an artist, musician, and shopkeeper. He shares the rich history of his family's journey to the North Fork beginning in 1918 when his grandfather first settled in the area. We dive into the remarkable summer of 1939 when Albert Einstein became a regular visitor at Rothman's department store and formed a unique friendship with Ron's grandfather. Ron offers us a captivating stories of musical evenings and gatherings Einstein attended, painting a vivid picture of that special time. We also explore Ron's own experiences growing up on the North Fork, his journey through school and college, and his eventual return to his family's business after working on the South Fork. Together we look at the evolution of Rothman's department store, the changes in retail over the decades, and the significance of the newly opened Einstein Square. Join us as Ron reflects on the past and shares his hopes for the future of the North Fork. So I hope you enjoy episode 88 with Ron Rothman. This episode was recorded August 8th, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library Podcast today, and I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you. I want to thank Chris and Floyd Memorial for having me and doing this project because it's a great way for everyone to get to know the people of the community and people who are here.
Absolutely.
So
I'd like to just start off, if you could give us a introduction about yourself, where you were born and raised.
Well, Ron Rothman, and I was born in Eastern Long Island Hospital. I'm a third-generation Southolder. I spent my childhood up the street from where Southold School is, so that was my neighborhood. I grew up around the water and went to Southold School through 10th grade. And at that point, I went away to school in Massachusetts, the Williston Northampton School, where I graduated in my junior year.
And in terms of your ancestry, how far back can you go on either of your parents' side?
Well, my grandfather's parents immigrated from Eastern Europe and lived in Hoboken, New Jersey, where my grandfather was born. So his youth was a city kid. He ended up educating himself the best he could. He worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, New Jersey Central, as a stenographer, a telegraph person. There he happened to see my grandmother riding by on the train, and they met. She had a connection to the North Fork. Her aunt was married to a Dr. Sturmdorf who lived in Southold. And so my grandmother would spend time out here. And it was part of the reason my grandparents came out here in 1918.
And that's on your father's side?
That's on my father's side. My mother's side also immigrated from Europe. I'm not sure whether those grandparents, I believe they were born here. Mm-hmm. My mother's father was a dentist and pioneer of dental surgery at King's College in New York. And so they were a little more affluent than a lot of other people living around the city at that time.
Mm.
My grandfather's family, after they were married, they were living on the Lower East Side, where my grandmother and my mother lived in a nice house in Brooklyn.
Mm. Now, did they say why they came over from Europe?
I think it was, as with everyone in Jewish communities that were just making that immigration to get out of Europe in the late 1800s and make that trek to the land of opportunity.
Yes. And also, did you get to meet your grandparents?
My grandparents I knew. My great-grandparents, of course, not. And not my mother's father. He passed away in, I think, the late 40s. He was rather young.
Mm. So your father's father...
My father's father, they came out here in 1918. And part of the reason they came out here, aside from they were married and looking for a new place to go and my grandmother's connection, 1918, they were living in the Lower East Side. And a lot of what was going on in 1918 was the flu epidemic of 1918. So this is what I'm surmising, that they saw death, they saw disease, they saw the Long Island Railroad, and they got on the Long Island Railroad and took it about as far as they could go to get away from all that.
And they settled on Southold.
They settled on Southold, I think, because of my grandmother's connection.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandfather came out. I think somehow his parents loaned him some money to come out, and in 1918 he rented a place in Southold to open up a dry goods hardware type of store, and then like the next year moved across the street and bought the building that Rothman's department store ended up occupying for almost 100 years.
And do you know of any information with your grandfather and with the store starting and its success? Were there any initial struggles or with getting it started at that time, and in terms of other stores throughout that area?
I think there were very few stores at that time in 1918. Very few merchant. It was limited what there was.
Mm-hmm.
I know at the same time, and it was sort of the same circle of people involved. I mean, you had the arcade, the Levine family. You had Rothman's department store, and there was another clothing department store, which was also a cousin of my grandfather's in Mattituck, Phillips department store, and they sold clothing. I imagine there were other stores, but not many.
Mm.
So he came out, obviously, to be a merchant, and did it the way where he built a customer base that stayed loyal to him for generations. I mean, there were second generation people that were still shopping at Rothman's even several years ago when we closed the main doors.
Mm-hmm. And even going through the 30s, through the Great Depression, do you have any stories about that period?
It's really pretty vague. It's nothing. They survived, and however they survived, one thing that my grandfather was always good about was extending credit. So he built a huge customer base by having his own. This was before Visa, before MasterCard, before people could put things on their credit card and max it out. They could shop at Rothman's. They'd write it down in the book. And even I remember into the 50s and early 60s, they still had Frank Berry going around weekly, knocking on doors to collect $1 or $2 from people who were paying off their extended credit that my grandfather, and people still would come up to me and go, oh yeah, we used to buy our washer and dryer, and he used to finance it for us. And I think that way of doing business, which you can't do today, I mean, money is worth too much, and they would rather give the interest to the credit card companies than a merchant who could afford to support his customer base.
Yes. And now moving more towards the late 1930s, in terms of the story involving Albert Einstein and your grandfather, was that the summer of 1939 that...
This was the summer of 1939. I mean, this is a story which over the last certainly 20 years I was involved in the store, I felt I was the story keeper. I was the one who people would come to look at the pictures that were there, and I would be the one relaying the story of my grandfather and Albert Einstein. Einstein was on Nassau Point the summer of 1938 and 1939. In 1939, there was a lot going on besides the New York World's Fair, and there was just a lot going on in the world, and Einstein had to get away from his Princeton teaching and wanted to go on vacation. I think he had been in Cold Spring Harbor a few years earlier and just went somewhere where he could bring his boat and sail. He came out. There was a July morning. Margot Einstein, Einstein's daughter, came into the store, who my grandfather would recognize. She comes in and she's looking for a sculpting tool. And she looks at it, and I think it was pricey. It might have been a little too expensive for her budget. Maybe she didn't need it as much. And with that, my grandfather said, "Here, take this as a gift. Give my regards to your illustrious father." This is how he put it to her. So the next day, who walks in but Albert Einstein? This little exchange, this little token of appreciation, either whatever it was, Einstein decided he would come in to shop. He walks in the store. The first thing he does, my grandfather has, like I had through the years, music playing in the store. He had a record, and I think it was like Mozart's 40th Symphony or something, and he walks in, and Einstein immediately goes and he starts conducting. Air conducting. It's sort of like air guitar, but, you know, in his mind, you can see he was somewhere else in the music. And he says, "Oh, I see you like music." That was the first connection. Then he goes, "I would like a pair of sundials," in his thick German accent. Now, my grandfather, overly excited and enthused that Einstein is in his store, is like, "I don't have any sundials, but quick, I'll take you, show you mine." And he goes out back where he has a sundial in his garden, and he goes to show it to Einstein, and Einstein lets out a big belly laugh and just goes, "No, my atrocious English, sandals." He was looking for beach shoes. Now, okay, so now they go back in the store, and Einstein, you know, embarrassed, whatever, you know, by the whole scene, buys the pair of sandals that my grandfather had sitting on the shelf, as I understood it. Now, think nothing of it, point nothing with it, and over the years, you know, people would come in and go, "These are women's sandals. What is he doing women's sandals?" So, tongue-in-cheek, when I relay the story, I say he just bought a pair of women's sandals because that's all my grandfather had left. He was embarrassed. He said, "Give me the sandals, I'll take them, whatever, I don't have to wear them." Moving fast forward, I've seen ads with these same European-style sandals, they're men's sandals, and it's not a question of why was Einstein buying women's sandals, it's what was my grandfather doing, selling European-style sandals in Southold in 1939, and there must have been a market for it. That's all I could say. So with that connection, they arranged to play music, finding out each one was an amateur musician, and my grandfather played violin, Einstein played violin. My grandfather the day he's going over to Einstein's on Nassau Point, he puts together a portfolio of 5 or 6 tunes to play.
Mm-hmm.
And he takes the most difficult one, buries it in the bottom of the pile, goes, puts it on the music stand, and of course Einstein goes, thumbs through them all, and which one does he pick out? The most expensive piece. So they go to play, and of course my grandfather's struggling, and between the two of them, Einstein said, well, why don't we just sit and we'll talk? And it started a summer of conversations where my grandfather, with his 8th grade education, was able to communicate with one of the greatest minds of the 20th century.
Wow. And in terms of that summer of 39, how frequently would they meet?
I would think in the course of those 2 months, they must 3 or 4 times a week. I mean, I think they spent a lot. There are a lot of anecdotes of a lot of different things they did. There were a number of different musical. My grandfather would arrange a musical quartet for other musicians to play with Einstein. They'd have musical evenings at my grandfather's house. People would congregate out on the street. It would be like standing in Einstein Square, listening to the music of these people playing out. There was some of the players were locals. Some of them. One thing Einstein said to my grandfather: arrange the quartet, but there must not be any jazz musicians. And I think he didn't want any hotshot players. So, but my grandfather was able to like slip in a couple of ringers, a couple of people who could really play. There was some mathematician who was out visiting, this Valentine Bargman, who was there for one of the sessions. Another thing my grandfather did, he had the whole Einstein entourage over for dinner. He arranged a dinner and which was tough because my grandmother was not around that summer. She had a health issue and was recuperating somewhere down west in Glen Cove, and so she never really was there. So my grandfather was putting these events together. He had a dinner for Einstein's family. Also, Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears, Benjamin Britten, one of the foremost composers of the 20th century, was also staying at my grandfather's house for part of that summer and would visit. And so he arranged a musical evening where my aunt, who was 6 or 7 at the time, who later became a Juilliard pianist, she was entertaining Einstein. And then Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears performed for him in the house. And my grandfather asked him, what do you think of these guys? And Einstein told him he will go far. He was already a pretty known composer at the time. And they did a lot of road trips. They did, went to the RCA Tower where Tesla was doing his stuff. I think there was a communications tower that they went to visit. They would go to, there was some meeting they went to at the firehouse where he brought Einstein and they wanted to get him to speak. He didn't want to speak, so he got up and gave him some one-liner. Then, pretty much put them in their place and said, don't ask me anything else. So...
And as you said, he was in Cold Spring Harbor. Was that the summer before, possibly, or? I
think it was maybe 36, 37. Because I'm pretty sure 38 he was documented on Nassau Point, and obviously 39, all of this took place. The most dramatic thing that took place, there was a letter that was drafted to Roosevelt that was postmarked Peconic because it was drafted on Nassau Point. Leo Szilard was put up to it by some of the European physicists that the Germans were working on refining uranium, And so as word got down the pike, somebody should do something to send a letter, to make a statement. Who would be a good one to do this? And they said Einstein. So Leo Szilard and Wigner came out here. I believe the second person, Wigner, came because he's the guy with the car. It was Szilard who was coming to really talk to Einstein about this letter. They showed up at Einstein's cottage on Nassau Point after getting lost. Somebody directed them. If you know Nassau Point, it's very confusing. It's very easy to get lost trying to find it, especially in the 30s when you don't have GPS.
Yes.
And so as far as they get there, and my grandfather is sitting there with Einstein when they show up. Now, history could have fractured fairy tales, as I sort of tongue-in-cheek in my book. He's sitting there, and I say they're coming because Einstein was friends with the Queen of Belgium. The uranium was coming from the Belgian Congo. So they were really coming to, let's write a letter to the Queen of Belgium and tell them to shut this down. And my grandfather's sitting there, and he says, well, you live in America, send the letter to Roosevelt. But you don't have to believe that either. So anyways, these are some of the things that took place that summer. That was pretty impressive that my grandfather was sitting there, so yes. He says.
And with World War II starting, did your grandfather ask Einstein about his thoughts on the war? And
I think many discussions were, because at that time it was certainly early. I mean, I think Germany had, at what point they had just rolled into Poland, and they could see there was, Einstein already knew that bad things were going to happen. He was living in Germany, and the Germany troops come in to his house. They start to search, and they find a set of steak knives, which they say, oh, look, weapons. Which they take, and I think they might have smashed his boat that was there. He turned to his family and goes, we have to leave. We'll never come back. And I think that's when made him say, I have to get out of Europe. And over the next few years, there were a number of letters that went back and forth. And in one of them, he's talking about the progression of the war was going good. This was in the late 40s, or 44 or whatever, I think, that letter.
Yes. And also, what about his thoughts on the North Fork and the region, or just
Einstein?
With Einstein, because he had picked, I don't know, did he pick Nassau Point, or was that just...
I think he must have, and I think because he had his boat.
Yes.
So he wanted a place he could have his boat, a place he could, use his boat and float around the bay. Some of the best. He would have stayed here, but I think for health reasons with his family, he had to go to a little drier climate, so that they moved to Saranac Lake. So the next year, in 1940, they were up in Saranac Lake, and my grandfather actually arranged and shipped his boat up there for him.
Wow. And from what I heard, he wasn't really a good sailor. In terms of were there any stories where your father had to help him?
Over the years, I think this is true because I've met countless numbers of people that we rescued. My grandfather rescued Einstein. He was lost. He would go out and he would just sort of float around absent-mindedly. I don't know that he was a good sailor. I don't know he could get where he could go. That he can, because he always got back eventually. But there was one time, and I don't know whether he was bringing the boat over when they were going to be moving it. He was bringing it from Nassau Point over to Town Creek and Southold. And he was supposed to arrive at noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 2 o'clock, whatever the time frame. Doesn't show up. He's not there. So now my grandfather's getting a little concerned. Then late in the afternoon, he gets a knock on the door. It's a local constable with, Mr. Rothman, I have this wild-looking guy who says he's a friend of yours, and he's looking for you, And so he He kind of got lost in thought coming over here, ended up 2 or 3 hours late, and there was no rescue except in the fact, come on in, and he probably went, as Einstein did, and took a nap on the couch, which he would do.
And also at this time, how old was your father?
My father was 10 or 11.
So did he ever, he could probably remember.
He had memories, and like I say, my aunt was 6, and she had memories because she played piano for Albert Einstein, which is this whole story. Growing up, it was sort of taken for granted. It never had any real relevant, because, my grandfather knew Einstein. Because there were pictures, and, there's pictures of Albert Einstein. My father, he was 10, and in an interview with the New York Times 10, 15 years ago, because they're asking him similar question, what he knew about Einstein and remembered. His comment was, he was an 11-year-old boy, and Einstein had his grandson there who was 8. So my father was in charge of, entertain Huddy, or Einstein's grandson. So they would go places, and he'd be riding in the back seat with Huddy, with Einstein and my grandfather. And all I could say is, I'll take it. I'll ride in the back seat with Einstein. That's okay. So that was pretty... that was his main recollection, because at that age he was more inconvenienced to he didn't know who the woolly, hairy guy was. He just knew that he had to take the 8-year-old out in his boat and go crabbing with him or something.
And moving forward, even through the war, were there any other stories that your grandfather had said about just even Einstein's involvement with the war efforts?
No,
Not really.
the only efforts that I could see that were trying to get, you had to get recommendations for people if they wanted to immigrate. And there was an exchange in some of the letters to try and get Einstein on board with getting someone to immigrate. They had discussions. From science, philosophy, religion. They would talk on and on. Obviously, when they were together, it was before the war. So later, their only conversations were through a series of 11, 12 letters that went back and forth. The letters, some were insignificant. 1 or 2 of them where he talked about the war. He talked about, I think my grandfather asked him, whatever became of your manuscript? And Einstein, writes back and says he deemed it good for nothing and threw it out. So obviously that type of letter, had some substance to it.
Yes.
The others were, thank you for taking care of my boat. Give my regards to our friends in the musical evenings that we spent together. Thank you for. And as time went on, the connection between them. The one thing my grandfather did that was pretty significant. Early on, he said, "Well, could you ever explain to me the theory of relativity?" And he would say, okay, someday. So they had a lot of time together. So one evening, Einstein says, get a piece of paper. So Einstein sat down and started writing out his theory on a piece of paper. Now, it wasn't necessarily equal to MC squared. It was part of it. I believe it was Lorentz theory, and which had to do with the compression and the speed and motion and things which normally nobody understands unless you're aware of it. But so he's writing down with this longhand mathematics, and my grandfather had told him, do this without using mathematics. And he's writing it out, and my grandfather goes, but I said, don't use mathematics. And Einstein looks at it and he goes, yes, but this is all trivial. So with that, he gave him the piece of paper. It wasn't signed by Einstein. At that time, my grandfather had written on the bottom, this is Einstein's longhand. And then later on, he actually wrote it again and signed it that this was Einstein's because he rewrote it. It's probably one of 4 Einstein theories, they say, that is handwritten.
Wow.
And it's which is no longer owned by us, obviously. And it is one of 4 that Profiles in History, when they first put it at auction, said it was probably the key piece of any Einstein collector. It would just be one of the most significant things there was. And the other thing that the pictures, there's a series of maybe a dozen pictures, walking on the beach, showing the sandals, showing the boat, sitting on the rock. There's a colorized one on the internet of it, historically colorized Einstein. If anybody ever Googles Einstein sandals or Einstein Southall, that's what you come up with. Those pictures were taken by Reginald Donahue, and those pictures were taken not on my grandfather's request. Einstein told my grandfather, said, hey, why don't we get a photographer and do a photo shoot on the beach? So that's what they did. They walked on the beach, they took pictures. And if anyone ever sees that colorized photo, you'll notice under my grandfather's arm is a folded up newspaper. That's because they got to the beach and the newspapers are blowing all over the place because people just threw things around back then. So Einstein goes, we must not let the beach be littered. So him and Einstein are running around the beach picking up the newspaper. You could picture Albert Einstein in his sandals and shorts running around picking up newspapers. Those photos is just a nice collection, and to show my grandfather dressed for work in his suit and tie, and Einstein in the contrast in his, shorts and sandals.
Yes. No, I saw some of those photos are really lovely. And I was just, before we move on to your parents, were there any other stories that come to mind that, in terms of your involvement with your grandfather and Einstein, that...
Those are, there were many of, the anecdotes that took place that summer were put together in my aunt's book, My Father and Albert Einstein. What she did, she interviewed him in the early 60s, and he went through and relayed, all his stories, all his adventures, and she put it together in her book with her own notes on each of them. So it's not only, it's my grandfather's stories and her remembrances and her things that she could relay to people. So when I did my book, I sort of I didn't want to cut her out. I just added a lot of my own stuff. She had the marriage diary. I just added a few key parts of it, and I added a few more of the anecdotes. The thing that sticks out most in my mind from that is they went to visit Einstein because my grandmother she was away that summer, so they made arrangements to go visit him in Princeton. So they made the big trip. The train to New York, the train to Princeton. He brings them another pair of sandals, which he goes, oh, thank you so much, but my other ones are just so elegant. And as he's going to leave, he puts his hand on my grandfather's shoulder and says, that was the best summer of my life, and I owe it to your initiative. And that's why when you go to Einstein Square, Jonathan Tibbett got it a little wrong. He says, happiest summer ever on the big picture there. But it was essentially what he said. It was one of the best summers of his life. And he owed it to my grandfather.
Wow. It's incredible. And now, in terms of moving forward, in terms of your parents, your father went through school in Southold?
He was born and raised in Southold. He obviously was a part of the store from probably as soon as he was able to work the cash register or sweep the floors. And went to Southold School. Very avid sailor. member of the yacht club. He sailboat races. He had countless star sailing class starboat trophies, because that's what they would race at the time. He went to Syracuse, where, majored in business, because I think his intention, he knew he was going to be involved in running the store. That's where he met my mother. Mm-hmm. And as they've moved back here, she was a Brooklyn girl, came out to Southold and raised a family.
And did your father say anything about what it was like in terms of the environment on the North Fork or in Southold at the time?
It was very obviously rural. Mm-hmm. And I think because the water was, fish, sail, just like we all did, the next generation, and how people today still appreciate the North Fork for those reasons. He was involved in the fire department, the temple. I mean, everything there was, because it was limited, so you sort of, to see people and socialize and be involved with people, people did that. Plus, they needed firemen. They needed people involved in things, just like today.
Yes. And so when he came back to Southold, did he end up taking over the
I don't think he ever really left, per se. As he was only away he was too young to go to war. Mm-hmm. So I think he was 16 or 17 in the mid-40s. But he was able to be in the fire department because they needed people, because all the rest of the men had gone off to either the Europe or... So they needed people. So from the mid-40s, he was involved in the fire department things.
And how many siblings did you have?
I have two brothers. My older brother went through Southold School, went away to school in Union College in Schenectady, and has lived there ever since. 10, 15 years ago, people would talk about home with him, and he's like, well, the North Fork, I lived for 17 years, and I've been living in Schenectady ever since. My younger brother was living here up until maybe 10 years ago, and he's moved to Florida. Mm-hmm.
So you're the only one?
I'm probably the last footprint of a Rothman in Southold. So, and I live in Peconic, actually.
Yes. And now for you growing up, how was it for you? How would you describe the area, even as a child, and what activities would you do in the area?
Well, the area lends itself to the water. And I think activities tend to center around the things we did: fishing, clamming, crabbing, boating, sailing, water skiing, certainly for a few months out of the year. And then winter would come, and at the time, they'd roll on the sidewalks and everybody would go into hiding. There were plenty of things to keep busy with. And certainly if you had parents that involved you in certain things, there were plenty of things. I mean, you still have a skating rink in Greenport. Mm-hmm. That was always one of the activities. Mm-hmm. And then between YA dances and things like that, it sort of spread your community out across the whole North Fork, because you'd have mixing with Mattituck to Orient type of things.
Yes. And then I forgot to ask, in terms of your mother, did she work with your father in the store? Did she have another job?
She was never involved in the store. At the time, fortunately, you could have a one-person working family. And so she came out here. She was involved in many, other things from... She obviously, her primary thing, she had 3 boys. Mm-hmm. So that was her focus, through the 60s, as everything. And amongst being, between North Fork Theater, the Democratic Party. There were just like many things that she was involved with that certainly kept her busy. As everybody became more established, she went back to advance her education and become a teacher. In doing so, she became third grade teacher in Orient for 25 years. So I still, to this day, third grade being one of the more formidable, happy years for many people. The number of people who say, oh, Mrs. Rothman was our favorite teacher, they still come up to me and say that. So that was her, she was very social and very active, tennis, golf, whatever, mahjong. Later on, she would, her day would be she'd go and play tennis in the morning, go for a sail in the afternoon, then play mahjong, and then be bored because she has no one to go to dinner with. So
is that because your father was still would be a...
No, this is later on, but they were both that way. They were both had that sense of there's just so many things to do. So they would be out doing them, whether it's, like I say, tennis, mahjong, sailing.
And now, to get back to you in terms of your time growing up in Southold, would you, even as a child or in your middle school, high school, I know you went off the last 2 years.
Though,
but would you stay mostly in Southold? Would you go to Greenport or...
It started in Southold, but as I got into middle school and it became the friend base expanded. So I have to say at that point I started hanging out with more Greenport people and spending a lot more time in Greenport. Just people I knew, girls I was dating or whatever would bring us. We'd come after school, hitchhike down and go to the Paradise Suites for, milkshakes and hamburgers. And that sort of expanded the base for people because after 12, 15 years, whatever, with the same group of people, which was small. I mean, Southold School was smaller than Greenport. All small by comparison to when you get to some, Nassau County type of school districts. But it was a real good way of expanding and meeting new people and spending time with new people.
Yes. And what year was that when you were in high school?
That was the early 70s.
Early 70s.
70, 72.
And how would you describe Greenport at that time? Was it, as some people might say, it was rough or...
I never saw it as rough. Just because you kind of knew most people. You knew...
You recognized the faces.
You knew who people were, and there was no... If anybody, got into trouble or had altercations, they probably had it coming. Or they did something to... But it's... do I feel... I still... Which leads myself to still feel the same way in Greenport. The town, it was a little shabby. It was somewhat run down. It was at a time when there was still a fishing industry. You still had Coopers. You still had a commercial fishing industry. You had, and the people have brought this up before, I mean, Greenport used to have at least two active hardware stores and the arcade right in town. They had things available for people to go buy that they need. Not just T-shirts and coffee mugs and hot sauce and cigars. Today, that has sort of disappeared.
Yes.
But I think that's disappeared a lot of places, those type of stores, as those type of stores have steamrolled by the Ace Hardwares and the Home Depots.
Yes. Now, in terms of how was your schooling experience if you want to talk about whether through elementary or into high school in South.
Southold, it was a small school. I mean, I was a better student, so I was able to get by without much trouble. I found it was an okay education. I found it wasn't quite stimulating enough for my children. When you had teachers telling him he's just too inquisitive and asks too many questions, it leads you to worry about how much they're actually educating and not just, teaching. I had an okay education. My reason for leaving, I think, were the times. I was planning to graduate in my junior year from Southold. I went away to school in that summer before that, figuring maybe it would give me the extra credits I need to make it easier. In doing so, where I went, they said I could do the same thing there. My parents felt it would give me a better basis for furthering going to college to graduate from a school in Massachusetts than Southold. So it was an okay education. I mean, it's small enough. And at the time, it was a little more progressive. I think they cut back a lot of that as testing and things like that. But that's education everywhere.
Yes. And what would you say you were most interested in, even through your early high school, or even when you went off to Massachusetts? What subject matter were you?
Well, I wasn't really as much of an academic as much as a hands-on experience. So when I went away that summer, at that time I started getting interested in photography. I did more and more when I was in Massachusetts. I was taking pictures for the yearbook. I was learning about darkroom techniques and working in the darkroom. It sort of grew with me, where the fine arts sort of came into mind. I had been playing some guitar, and it didn't quite manifest till a few years later. But the photography, and it sort of gave me something to work for other than academics.
And graduating in Massachusetts, did you know what you wanted to do coming out of there, graduating from there?
No, I wasn't one of those, I'm going to be a doctor.
Yeah.
I mean, I think at the time the big thing was liberal arts education. And obviously without that focus of where it was going to go, I wasn't a fan of the sciences. I mean, interest, and I was able to get by, but when it came to memorizing things and chemistry and things like that, it was a little tough. So I just was looking for a liberal arts college, one hopefully that could give you that well-rounded background of education.
And then, so you went off to Alfred University for a BFA in photo printing?
I went to Alfred for liberal arts in the state in the university, and I was taking art courses. I was taking photography and some of the foundation courses, which were the basis for because they have New York State School of Ceramic Art, which is pretty well respected. And as I'm there and seeing their foundation program, I transferred into it, the School of Ceramics, which in some ways was good because it was going from a private school to a state school. So I think my parents liked the idea of it. Although the idea of what do you do when you're an artist. As I was doing photography, I was also taking printmaking courses. I was doing stone lithography, and which developed into a lot of photo processing printing methods, photo offset printing and photo etching, using photo images in a printing photo images other than just the photograph. So as I took one semester off in between, and then went back and went through their foundation program and got more involved in the printmaking processing as part of my studio focus.
And it was a small town, even smaller than
Alfred, yeah.
Smaller than South.
Alfred itself, if you took the state university and there's a state college, if you took them out of the picture, it's like a one street town.
Yeah.
It's.
But were you thinking at the same time when you were in Massachusetts, you weren't thinking of coming back to the North Fork?
I never had that in my mind. Did I want to come back and work in the store? No. When I went to Alfred. I went through the program. I graduated. I had somewhat the intention, the backup plan of I had education requirements, and short of student teaching, I could pursue becoming an art teacher. As I came back, my now wife was living over in Montauk, and we ended up moving over to Southampton. And there was a federal program, a CETA program, that East End Arts Council was administering. And it was an artist in public service program, which I landed a job with them for a year or so. And this involved with East End Arts going into public places, nutrition centers, private schools, and administering art programs, whether it was poetry, music, drawing. We had a core group of artists that went and did this program, and it gave me a basis first for teaching, and sort of set me in a direction also involving me in the Hamptons art scene, as I was spending time with some of these Hampton artists who still are around today. And when that ran out, we were still living in Southampton, and I was doing some classes still through Rogers Memorial Library and the Parish Art Museum. I did a photography darkroom program and stuff that were set up, administered, and as I was doing all this, still trying to pursue do my own art. I was becoming more involved with playing music, so that was becoming a part of it. As we were in the Hamptons, my wife was working at Parish Art Museum, so there was still a connection there, and immersing myself in the Hamptons art scene. I became involved with playing in a band on the North Fork, and so I was going back and forth, and in doing so, my father was one of, I really need some help, I really want you to come and get involved. So I started getting involved, and a year or so later, we ended up moving back to the North Fork, where I took over more or less running the store.
That's interesting. With a lot of family stores, I think whether your grandfather would expect your father to take over, and then your father would hope one of his sons would take over.
You would hope for something of this, the legacy perpetuates itself. I mean, unfortunately, with retail, it's. I mean, I wouldn't never have wished my son to get involved. Although if he did, it's a blank tablet. That was the beauty of it. It was pretty much the type of store which sold everything, so you could sell anything.
Even in the 80s when you were there.
Even over the years, I would look around and there'd be stuff sitting there that had been there forever, and somebody would come in and buy it. Yeah. And my feelings were, well, everything eventually sells.
Yes.
And when I got involved, I obviously was looking for, on that basis, anything will eventually sell, but I was looking for, from gifts to, they were always the main core. We sold GE appliances, we sold major name bedding, we sold from TVs to stereos to patio furniture. And it was full time just keeping the place merchandised. I mean, every spring you had to think of that telescope order for the furniture and, the Weber grills, all the things that we would for years had been selling, and for years people still keep coming back for. I was also looking for other things. And other things, whether that would be of interest to me. Now, there was always guitars. I kept a few. You'd always have a few guitars and sell strings. And then in the early '90s, I wanted a Martin bass, and we went to one of the big Mandolin Brothers in Staten Island, and they didn't have one. And it was like, oh, we'll get one, we'll call you. And my wife goes, well, why don't you just call Martin and see if they'll let you be a dealer? And I said, I don't think they would, but I will. And they did. So in the early 90s, I became a Martin guitar dealer, which helped to establish me it gave me street cred. I mean, I'm selling the best guitars in the world, and which led me to get involved in the vintage guitar industry. And in doing so, I was pretty well established as a guitar music store, even though it was sort of a sideline because the store was doing big numbers, not with the guitars, but the appliances and the furniture and everything else, big numbers relative. And as time went on, as that sort of diminished, the guitars sort of became a more focus of the store, mainly because of my interest.
And even into the 80s and into the 90s, there was with the change in even big box retail. I don't know if that the online came later, but even, would you say in Riverhead, were there more stores opening up?
Yeah, there were, and they would come and they would go. Billy Blake's would become Caldors, which would become, and they'd all come and go. My grandfather used to keep a list. A list of all of them.
Yes.
We're still here, but, E.J. Corvette,
all these other ones.
All the ones that are gone.
Yeah.
And the thing that, while they would be in Riverhead and people would venture to shop there was just that extra distance away. Home Depot, you weren't going to run to Home Depot for a pack of screws. Now, you may go with your leaf blower there, but, then again, people start to realize that you're not saving anything, so why am I going there? Yeah. So it sort of insulated the East End. That's why the hardware stores in Southfield, I think, survived longer than a lot of them. But everyone fell by the wayside just about as you go out east. Harts. I mean, at one time, the Light in Southfield, there were 5 hardware stores per se. Southfield Lumber, 3 or 4 others.
I think that people said there were 3 in Greenport.
Yeah, there were with including.
Now there's none.
Now there are none. Now that's what. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, were you, after you had taken over or come back to help and take over the business, were you still able to work as an artist? And you said you had gotten involved in the music scene on the North Fork with the band. So you were still doing that while balancing?
Yeah, that was all. Since don't quit your day job.
Yeah.
So, there was it's not like it was anything viable. And things, I'll say hobbies, but you're pursuing it more as a vocation. And, it's a hobby because you don't make any money.
Yes. And also, was it more in the... Well, we might be jumping a bit, but you had also written a book titled Harmony, the People's Guitar, 1945 to 1975. Could you talk about why you decided to...
Well, out of the whole guitar thing and getting involved in the whole vintage guitar business, what happened... my grandfather always sold harmony guitars. So I always had harmony guitars from when I was old enough to hold a guitar. And so I had interest. I would see him, and it was before the internet. There were no books on them. There were one or two guitar books where the basic history was covered. So as I'm doing this, I'm starting to like put together a database of these guitars. And what I started doing, I self-published a newsletter through the store for the guitars. And I started doing articles on harmony guitars, on specific guitars, and putting it together. And a few of the articles appeared in 20th Century Guitar magazine through their encouragement, and a big guitar book dealer I was encouraged to put together and self-publish Harmony the People's Guitar, which I self-printed, self-published. And I sold out of it. I did a second edition of it where I expanded it a little bit. And as that was, I put it, as I was running through that printing of it, I was approached by Schiffer Publishing to put it together in, a coffee table book, which exists today. And I was able to, over the course of 2 or 3 years, put together a book with 300 or 400 photographs, most of the articles, and which at the time was really the only book on harmony guitars. And I think still to date, it might be the only book on harmony guitars, which was the most prolific manufacturer of guitars in America.
Yeah, I don't have a good knowledge of the guitars, and you you specialized in selling harmony guitars.
Well, just as I've known that just because of the book and my background. If I specialized in them, it's because I would go out of my way to get them, because I would see them, and I appreciated them and shared that appreciation with people who wanted them, which they did. Everybody's first guitar was like a Harmony Stella. A number of people that all said they started with one of those Harmony acoustic guitars.
And you also published another book, more essays in a paperback book, My Grandfather and Albert Einstein.
That was because I had to, in the situation in the store, people coming in to, they want to see the pictures, they want the stories. And my aunt, as I said, had done My Father and Albert Einstein. She had basically the interviews and the anecdotes all written down. And where I didn't want to rip her off, I sort of gave her credit for it, because a lot of it was her idea, the whole concept of it. The transcripts were invaluable in relaying it. My brother's essays in it were, early days of the internet, I mean, you're talking when in the late 90s, he had a science fiction website, and he had written his own story about Albert Einstein and relaying his memories of certain anecdotes, most of which they rehashed. And then the other essay by my cousin was, I included just to sort of expand it and beef it up a little bit, and mainly because he's a physics professor at Tufts, and in the early days before the internet, he gave everybody in his class the assignment: go find out about Einstein, what it had to do with Long Island. And then the next day, everybody came in because they had the internet. He didn't know this. And they came in with my brother Chuck's stories. So he was like, huh? What? How'd you find that out so easily? Which was kind of funny. It was just the changing times, because the internet has opened up a wealth of knowledge for all these subjects.
Yes. And even moving through the 90s, and how long did your father work?
My father pretty much worked right through up until he passed away, and he bowed out. He would go away more. He would wouldn't be there all the time. I would certainly was ended up being there more. But I think it's with sometimes retirement isn't for people.
Yes.
Sometimes, your daily routines, and he got out of the daily routine, but I think he still had his office. He still, would come in and putz around, bookwork, such.
And then did he see some of the changes, obviously, with the computer and a lot of things online and Amazon? Did he ever talk about...
No, I think it was it was just sort of starting. He passed away in 2011, I think.
Okay.
So it was there. I mean, but till Amazon really kicked in and people, Riverhead, you could get by, but the internet was everywhere. And when people started ordering on Amazon, I think that kind of killed retail as we know it.
Did the store become even more focused in what you were carrying, even going into when you moved the store west of the original spot?
Well, the store, we had both buildings for my father bought what was Kramer's drugstore in Southold in the early 70s. And we used that building for showroom. We used that building there was a lot of merchandise, so that would be one of the showrooms, was certainly for the appliances and the bedding and the furniture. So that building was there. It was a part of the store. As we got out of appliances and as I stopped, because mainly became not to compete, but the cost of selling them, because you needed trucks, you needed men to move them. And when it came down to my 80-year-old father and myself putting dryers in people's basements, I think much to his chagrin, because he was one of the oldest GE dealers in the country. When they first came out with a refrigerator, they started selling them. I started using the space as an art gallery and a performance space. So we were having concerts and art shows over the period of 7 or 8 years. And it was doing quite well. We'd sell some art. We'd have a good time because we had a lot of openings and a lot of fun doing it. What happened, the building I was in, the main building, 100 plus years old, it was in a really poor state it was really in disrepair. I had put a furnace in it because there really was no heat, which was a big waste because I ended up selling it 2 years later. But so things like that. I mean, it was just too much for me. It was just me, just the maintenance and the upkeep. It was a little much. So I decided I was going to put it on the market and sell it, being able to move next door and hopefully continue. So I did sell it, pretty much moved next door, and it was there, obviously, now as everything's sort of downsizing because of that. Less hardware, more guitars for a couple of years, and then the people who bought my original building, well, actually somebody else made an offer to my brother in Florida. They wanted to buy the building, which of course I didn't own it, but with them. And I told them I have to order it to Tibbet and Heitman because they, what they built the monument to my grandfather. So I offered to them, and we closed March 15th, 2020. Just as the world shut down.
Yes.
I had to give up my Martin dealership because I moved around the corner. I have a barn on Mechanic Street, but I wasn't going to sell Martin guitars out of the trunk of my car or out of the barn. And it's too bad I couldn't, because at that point I thought I'd have all these guitars. Within 6 weeks I sold every guitar I have of the lockdown. And where that was, it would have been the perfect for curbside service because it was right outside the door. But that's
people were...
But that's then. This is now.
Yeah.
And plus, I would have had to keep working.
Yes. Now, the current store, is it? What would you describe that you do you still have a venue space, and do you carry
I
still certain
The
things?
store for the most part is closed. I do have the barn, Petty's Blacksmith Shop, which is around the corner. I do have, yard sales a few times a year. I do still have internet, eBay type of business. Guitars pretty much I'm more or less out of the guitar business, which is fine because it reaches a point, retirement is good. My wife has been retired from teaching, and it gives us time. We were doing a fair amount of travel and things like that, which allows for us to do that, and I don't have to worry about being tied to a daily grind.
Yes. And you mentioned the Einstein Square. What were your thoughts when you saw the commencement and realization of that come to fruition?
Well, the whole thing was sort of, I was blindsided by it. In that I had no idea that that was their intention of what they were doing with it. I really, it sort of came about that they were kind of an original offer, which was rather low. And then I had another offer later that was better, and that fell through. And then I sort of went back to these guys, do you still want it? And at the closing, it was like, Einstein Square LLC, and I go, oh, isn't that cute? And then over the next couple of months, they laid it out to me that what they were planning to do, and my thoughts about it was it couldn't be a better thing. First off, it's preserving the legacy of my grandfather. The main thing, I figured the store was going to be a tear down. They proceeded to lift up all 7,000 square feet, literally lift it up, dig out a basement, preserve the whole building, renew the whole building, redo. There was an apartment that was never used for 50, 60 years that they made into an apartment. They preserved my grandparents' house almost exactly how it was the day they moved out. And they made this courtyard with a bust of Einstein, really, which is a monument to my grandfather, because it wouldn't be Einstein Square without David Rothman.
Yes. And it has the plaque
Yes.
below it, and
the painting too. That was Jonathan came up to me and he said, and he showed me a picture. He said, there's this parking lot in, I think it was Fort Lauderdale. And in the parking lot was this big mural of Einstein with all these rainbow things. And I was like, well, I think that's a little much for Southold. I don't know what you had in mind, but do what you want. And he ended up, I thought doing it, as tasteful as you can do in a way that it just perpetuates my grandfather's legacy.
Yes. And now, just looking back on growing up here and living here and your time working out here, what have you enjoyed the most about your time on the North Fork?
Well, I think the natural beauty. I think we live in just a gloriously beautiful place. We could walk to the beach. We have, where I am, a nice deserted beach, so we'll go up there and there'll be no one the whole length of you won't see a soul. The natural things there are to do. Now it's evolved into, between the wineries, the restaurants, there's plenty of opportunity for entertainment, the agri-entertainment, the between the farm stands that still exist, and there's just a lot of beauty, and it's nice to be able to still be here, as many people can't.
Yes. And I'm curious, obviously you've seen the North Fork change, Southold, and sometimes I like to ask people if there's anything that they miss about the way it used to be. Not that it has to be nostalgic in a sense, but just obviously some people have mentioned, well, I miss having hardware stores, and Greenport, or maybe there's too many fences or hedges going up. But is there anything that you miss?
No, because it's been like a slow evolution.
Mm-hmm.
So as I look back, I think the evolution is inevitable. I miss less crowds.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but I think that comes with everywhere, and the
Growth
fact
and success.
the close proximity to the metropolitan area
Mm-hmm.
and the internet. Many people now can live here where they had to go back to their day jobs in Manhattan or wherever. Mm-hmm. That's probably the biggest thing, because the rest has pretty much been consistent. I mean, the villages are pretty much this, except for the stores that are in them, are pretty much the same.
Mm-hmm.
The activities are still pretty much the same.
Mm-hmm.
You still have use of the water. You still have the beaches. You still have the boating.
Yes.
So things like that have been consistent.
Mm-hmm. And looking ahead, what do you hope for the future of the North Fork and its community further down? What would you hope to see?
The big thing, the biggest issue that's been out here, and I'm talking going back to when I was younger, was the affordability of staying here.
Mm.
And the big problem with that is the brain drain, the loss of the youth,
Mm-hmm.
the kids that can't afford to stay here anymore, probably more so than years ago, again, because you can now work from the internet, you can now do any other things, but can you make a living that's good enough to afford the rents or value of real estate to be able to stay here, and to be able to come up with some sort of affordable way to allow our children to stay here. My kids don't live here. But, then again, my daughter moved to an equally exclusive place, Key West. So it's the same thing there. But I think any place you want to be, you have that issue. Because a lot of supply and demand, a lot of people want to be there. So, of course, everything becomes more expensive.
And then it's also balancing open space, and because you could easily build more housing, but you don't want to have it a more of a sprawl as you would get like further west.
This has been a can people have been kicking down the road for years.
Yes.
And on the North Fork, especially, no one wants to pony up and say, this is what we have to do. You have a small project go in, somebody comes along, wants to do something, and you get more people that say, you can't do it because it's going to upset our quality of life. Now, upset our quality of life by giving housing to service people, I just don't. You need it. And if you're going to be in a situation where you have so much service industry, you need people who can serve. And if they can't afford to live here, the whole system collapses.
Yes. Would you say people have been talking about that since the 80s and 90s?
50 years.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe someday they'll realize we really just have to do this. And you see little bits and pieces, but it's not enough to accommodate the firemen, the teachers. The teachers can't afford to live here.
Yes.
So
really, for those essential workforce jobs, because then you do get people that might say that there's certain areas can't handle more in terms of the resources with taking in more people out here. But I think it's trying to balance that with
you need both.
Yeah.
And you can't, obviously the more people, the more people in the schools, the more, but that might be a good thing, because I think the schools are losing numbers.
Almost even they might have to consolidate.
Yeah, which might not be save a lot of money in terms of administrators.
Yeah. No, and then I think I usually just like to ask at the end if there was anything else you wanted to discuss or say that we haven't talked about?
No, I think the progression and the evolution of the North Fork is sort of in motion.
Mm-hmm.
We're still evolving. I think downtown Southold has changed drastically, and I might have been part of that because with Rothman's gone, that was a big chunk of downtown Southold where somebody was able to develop it in a way that might be able to add something to the community. They want to make it into a destination. They want to make it into a gathering space. And in doing so, people come into town and hope if there's anything left affordable to buy, that maybe they'll buy things. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they'll wander around the boutique stores and make it look like things are busy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, so I think I think we covered everything, but I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on today and share your story and really hear your wonderful story with your grandfather. That was really a joy to hear, and all your history with the store as well. It was a pleasure to have you on today.
Well, thank you, Chris. I really appreciate you thinking of me and including me. And I think it's a great way for the people out there to get to know people who are in the community who they might not cross paths with. Or in terms, I just did a talk on Einstein at Cutchogue Library. Mm-hmm. And Dawn Manwaring, when she said, well, you haven't done it in 3 or 4 years, and there's a whole new turnover of people from Brooklyn who don't know the story. Yes. I go and I say, oh, I used to be in Rothman's, and they go, where was that? Mm-hmm. So I think it's a great way for people to connect with the history and connect with the people who sort of made up this melting pot of the North Fork. And I hope my perspective on it as someone who was born in Eastern Long Island Hospital and been here for the most part of my life can convey what the North Fork is about and the people who are here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks again.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 88 with Ron Rothman. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.